All right, welcome to General Virology at Pittsburg State University. In this introductory chapter, Chapter 1, we are going to be talking about a few basic topics related to viruses. I'm going to have this split into two parts, but over these two videos, we'll talk about why study viruses, right? What's the importance of studying viruses? We will talk about the fact that viruses are not alive and why is that. Discuss possible origins of viruses, a little bit of the history of the discovery of viruses, and then we will finish just by talking about a couple of other non-living infectious agents. All right, so let's start with why study viruses. And of course, this class is virology, which is the study of viruses. So why would you want to take a virology class? Why would you want to learn about viruses? And there's some obvious answers to this, and some maybe less obvious. But really, the first reason is just that viruses are everywhere. So they are, all over planet Earth, in and on every living organism you can think about, every surface you can think of. It's estimated that there are 10 times more viruses than bacteria on the planet, and there are a lot of bacteria. So there's no escaping viruses. So it would make sense that we might want to learn about them. Um, of course, we know about viruses because of their relationship with living organisms. And I already mentioned in that introductory slide, viruses are not alive. So, okay, you could ask, well, why are we talking about them in a biology class, which is about living things? Well, it's because of that relationship that they have with living organisms. And, we're aware of the relationship being a harmful one usually, and certainly that can be the case. But there's lots of viruses that may have a symbiotic or potentially even a beneficial relationship with living organisms. But for sure, they've been around in human populations, probably since the beginning of the evolution of humans. Um, we do have some historical evidence for viruses. For example, this Egyptian tablet, you can see the character here has the drop foot phenotype that's characteristic of somebody that's been afflicted with polio. We found mummified remains that seem to bear smallpox scarring. So we think that, even some of these more modern viruses have actually been around for a very long time. And, we're all aware of viruses right now in 2020 because of disease, right? And have been aware of them for many years because of disease. So, we have these famous historic diseases, things like polio or smallpox or measles. Right now everybody's thinking about COVID-19, right? Coronaviruses. And we're going to certainly focus on those in this class. But I do want to make sure you have this sort of broad base of virology to build on as we get into some of the more complex details of COVID. And we'll also spend a fair amount of time this semester focusing on HIV. That's another very significant modern virus, of course, as well as a few others. And, these are terms I usually have to define, but we're all familiar with these because we are in the middle of a pandemic, right? Epidemic versus pandemic. Epidemic being a local outbreak, pandemic being a global outbreak. All too familiar with those. So, okay, so why study viruses? They're everywhere. Um, all living organisms, including ourselves, have relationships with viruses. They can obviously cause disease, which is arguably the main reason that we're interested in them. But they have also been used throughout the history of science and biology as tools to really help reveal how living systems work. And so, a lot of what we understand about how gene expression is regulated um, was revealed through work with viruses. Our understanding that DNA is the genetic material came from work with viruses. I'll talk about that in a minute. So some basic science, some basic biology can come out of studying that interaction between viruses and living organisms. And that's one of the things that I have a background in virology research. One of the things that's so interesting in studying viruses is, yeah, you can focus exclusively on the virus itself, um, but in looking at how viruses interact with living cells, how they hijack living cells, um, you can actually learn a lot about what makes those cells tick and what they're doing, irrespective of the viruses. Um, so just take this back to some basic biology, right? Hershey Chase, you probably learned about them in Biology 1. Alfred and Martha, so they were doing work with bacteriophages, which are viruses that infect bacteria, and they use these as a tool to demonstrate that DNA is the genetic material of these viruses, and in fact of basically all life on Earth. And so I don't want to get too lost in the details here. I know you've probably seen this before, um, but they knew that bacteriophage worked by attaching to the surface of a bacterium and then injecting whatever the genetic material was into the bacterial cell, and then that material was being used, right, as the blueprint to basically assemble new bacteriophage, and then they would reassemble, come bursting out, and go on to the next bacteria. They also knew that bacteriophage really just had two components. So they were made of protein and DNA. So one of those two molecules had to be the genetic material. And they did this quite simple experiment where they radioactively labeled either the DNA or the protein using two different radioactive isotopes. And then essentially they just let the bacteriophage, the radioactively labeled bacteriophage, do their thing and look to see, okay, which radioactive tag is being injected into the bacteria. And if it was the phosphorus 32, that would mean that DNA was being injected. If it was the sulfur 35, that would mean that protein was being injected. And of course, what they found was it was that P32, the DNA that was the genetic material that was being introduced into these cells by the phage. And so that really set the stage for our understanding that DNA is the genetic material and the whole molecular biological revolution that has followed. So we can learn a lot about living systems by seeing how they interact with viruses. And then, of course, we're going to tend to focus on the negative effects of viruses, but I do want to point out viruses do have beneficial uses and are and can be used in certain therapies. So there's something called phage therapy, which is using those bacteriophage, like we were just talking about, to try to kill bacteria. And these were actually used back in the day before antibiotics to try to treat bacterial infections. And now phage therapy is sort of coming back into vogue again as we're starting to see antibiotic resistant bacteria spread across the globe. Um, and then another big use for viruses in modern medicine has been what's called gene therapy. If you're not familiar with that, that is trying to introduce a normal, non-mutated copy of a gene into a cell to compensate for a mutation that's causing a genetic disorder or genetic disease. And viruses are used in that regard as basically as the delivery vehicle. So you would insert the non-mutated, the good copy of your gene into a engineered virus, and then let the virus deliver that into a cell. So lots of reasons to study viruses. Again, in the middle of a pandemic, I don't think I need to have to sell it too hard, um, but we'll bump into all of those good reasons through the course of this semester. Next, I want to talk about the fact that viruses are not alive, right? I already mentioned it may seem weird to have a class dedicated to viruses in biology if, if biology is the study of life and viruses are not alive. But why aren't viruses considered to be alive? And so we have this sort of laundry list here of characteristics that any living organism have to possess. So have to have a genome, some genetic material, have to be able to carry out metabolic activities, right? Basically, basic biochemistry, things like respiration or photosynthesis if you're a plant. Um, any of these chemical reactions that are important for keeping organisms alive, have to be able to reproduce and grow. Usually you're thinking mitosis in the case of eukaryotic cells, or binary fission in the case of bacteria. Um, have to be able to interact with their environment, compensate for changes in the environment, basically maintain homeostasis, right? Keep a steady internal environment. And have to be part of a population that can adapt to the environment through evolution. And if we think of this in terms of viruses, well, viruses really only have two of these characteristics. So they do have a genome, they have genetic material, and viruses do exist in populations, and they are subject to selective pressures, and viruses can evolve. Populations of viruses can evolve, usually to our detriment. But because they're lacking numbers 2, 3, and 4 here, we really, by a biological definition, can't consider them to be alive. But as we're going to talk about, they are intracellular parasites, so viruses have to be associated with a living cell in order to do their thing. So they are tied to life in that regard. Um, and just to emphasize this difference in terms of reproduction versus replication, if we think of basic cell division, mitosis being reproduction, right? Birth of new cells, you're all familiar with that basic process. When we talk about viruses, quote unquote, reproducing themselves through what we would call the replication cycle, this is actually a arguably more complex molecular cycle that would involve everything from virus attaching to the surface of the cell, entering that cell, uncoding, making copies of its genome, assembling new virus particles, and then escaping from that host cell. So all those things would all be part of that replication cycle, and we'll talk about replication cycles in coming chapters. Um, I wanted to introduce this term, virions, which are these infectious virus particles, and we'll look at their structure in more detail. So let me stop there. I'm breaking these lectures up into smaller pieces just to try to keep file sizes smaller, but I'll pick this up in part 2.